inside the recording studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom.
Hello, Mr. Whitesides.
Hello, Mr. Hellstrom. How are you?
I am doing very well, thank you. How about yourself?
I'm doing all right. I cannot complain.
Good.
Yes.
Like I always say, we don't want to hear it anyway.
That's probably quite true.
Yeah, well, just like life, stuff happens up and down. But yeah, everything's good.
Back, forth, left, right, up, down, left, and center. All right. So today, without any further ado, we are looking at part three. Part three.
Can you count there, Jody?
No, I can't count. I'm holding up 6 fingers and then closing 3 at a time when I do that. All right, we are looking at part 3 of how to layer guitars when doing your shit in a recording to get a fuller sound. Pardon my French. So we have done the whole concept of the first 2 parts were kind of on the tracking side. Now we're moving on to part 3 and 4, where we're going to be talking about the mixing side of everything that you've just tracked with all these different guitars and amps and pickups and all that kind of stuff. Is that correct?
That is correct, as I understand it.
Fantastic.
Yes,
I'm feeling good now.
He's amped, people. He's amped. Let's get ready to go.
Let's do it. What are we talking first here?
Well, the first thing I think we need to touch on is we discussed in prior episodes how to track what kind of printing of effects, etc., that we're going to do. And we may also even, as a safety, have a DI track of the guitar as well. Should we need to do any reamping?
Yeah,
we're not going to talk about.
We really didn't mention that, though. I kind of hinted at it having the AB box kind of thing, but
yeah.
But
we're not going to talk about reamping per se today.
No.
We've done that, and we've imported all our tracks into our mixing session, and now we're going to start with all the other fun stuff.
Yeah.
To kind of make it sound really, really nice and cool. So, when I sit down and do that, let's say, if I'm part of the production team and I'm perhaps the engineer at the guitar recording session, I kind of have an idea where I want things to be. But the first thing I would do is essentially just listen back to what we have and start making decisions on where I would like to hear certain parts.
Sure. But when you say you're listening back to what you have, does that mean you have like all your faders up at 0 or at -6 or -18? Where do you got them, and do you have everything on all at once?
Yes. No, I do have.
That's just that's a general question. Are you talking about you're just listening to the guitars, or do you have everything else up too? And what are you talking about?
No, generally I will have everything else up too.
Okay.
And just to sort of reacquaint myself with the song.
Sure.
So hopefully there's drums, there's bass, there's possibly keyboards, there's probably vocals. And when I'm doing that, obviously the only concern I'm thinking about faders where they are is that I'm just not clipping stuff.
Sure.
I just want to have it. I'm not worried about exactly where placement are yet, but I'm trying to make decisions now on what are the most prominent parts, what's the driving part, and what is a supporting part. Is this like,
when you say you're trying to make decisions on this, is this you as the artist, or you as the producer, or you as the producer with an artist who should already know what their main parts are?
At this point, I'm coming from the perspective of wearing the mix engineer hat.
Right.
And I say that in the sense that if I've been part of the process, I'm obviously a little bit more familiar with it.
Yep.
But if it's a mix that is coming to me that I've had no input in before, I want to familiarize myself with what is there first and kind of get that fresh perspective on something. And those fresh perspectives, I think, can be really, really valuable because we mentioned in the past episodes here that if you are part of the process from the get-go, you have a preconceived notion. You're aware of what's going to happen. And there's also a chance of that demo-itis thing.
Demo-itis.
Sneaking in, right? You're consciously or subconsciously comparing it to the way that you might have heard it before.
They need a vaccine for that.
Yeah. And the only thing that I think you can do with that is to essentially stay away from it for a while, right? And that's
Stay away
not
from the song?
Yeah, if you can, but that's, we don't necessarily always have that luxury,
Sure.
right? So it's just, but that's what I'm doing first, and I'm trying to get a feel for where I might want to place parts.
Right.
And I say place, not just level, but also like, is this going to be, is this part hard left, hard right type of a thing? Is it a doubled part? Is this a supporting thing or is this a throw that's going to come out from a different angle or whatever? So I'm making those decisions first.
Okay. Does that mean you start everything up center and then you just start moving things left and right, or?
Yeah, generally,
Okay.
Unless I have a track that is, it might be named main guitar left, that kind of thing, main guitar right, then I will pan those anyway. But generally I start with things right down the middle, just to see what's there.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So that's what I do. And then I start thinking from there. Is this let's say, a part that is just doing a supportive hit on a certain chord that I want to bring out, and that's why that was recorded? I will place that generally at the same part of panning where the part it is supporting is. Did that make any kind of sense?
Not really, but I'll follow with you.
but let's say that there's a main rhythm guitar part that is hard right. And there might be a section of the song where another guitar is doubling just that part, just for effect, perhaps with a brighter sound or a cleaner sound, like we talked about the prior podcasts. I will place that hard right as well, so that it's just there to kind of reinforce that part and not have that come out of left field somewhere.
Okay.
So I'm making those kind of decisions at that point.
Gotcha.
I'm not thinking yet of any kind of like EQ or anything yet. I'm just kind of placing things level wise. What about you? What's your approach when you do that?
Generally, if I have been involved with it from the get-go, as a producer or a recording engineer, and I'm now switching hats to the mixing engineer situation, or I'm getting a project I'm the mixing engineer, I'm hoping that things are properly labeled.
Yes.
And that people already have the ideas of where they're supposed to be and a concept of what they're doing when they've tracked it. Generally speaking, I know when I'm creating a part as the artist where it's supposed to go in the sonic field based on my cognitive dissonance in my head of what I've heard.
Sure. Yeah.
If that makes any sense. So in that regard, I start everything centered, like everything's up the middle. And then as I look at the track names and I'm knowing, I start twisting knobs and pushing them into the positions that they're supposedly going to be in. And then I listen. I generally start most of my mixes where all of my tracks are at like a -6 dB on the channel fader, so that I have room to move up and down from where I'm at.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's just one of those things where I start getting levels and start doing the positionings. And also a lot of my positionings may end up being dependent upon the section of the song that I'm in. Because more often than not in the chorus, that's when things really get pushed out to the sides, and the verses maybe not so much.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and what do you think could be some of the pitfalls if you have, let's say, a verse part and you've left that soul guitar pan hard left or something like that?
well, hopefully if it's not another guitar to balance it, which is not what we're really talking about, I hopefully have another instrument that's supposed to balance that.
Yeah, because it can make the balance or the mix feel unbalanced, right? It's
Tip
like,
heavy.
it's yeah.
I'm going too far to the side. Oh, bring it back. Balance. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So that's my general, like, where I'm beginning when I start placing the guitars in a mix. I have to be very aware of my other instrumentation, what part of the song I'm in. Is there notation already based on the concept of having planned ahead, as we have talked about in the first part of this whole thing, to know where parts are supposed to go in the pre-planning process. Obviously, once you get to the stage of where you're placing things, maybe your plan didn't work quite as well. And maybe where you thought you wanted to place it isn't the place it needs to be. So there is that thing that could happen, but generally speaking, the plan should be kind of stuck to up until a point where you realize, oh, this isn't working, and you change that plan. But that's how I would start. And of course, as you had mentioned as well, whether a part is supposed to be something that is more front and center or more supportive also changes, like, where things belong in the mix, which is why I talk about having the notes and planning it out and talking where it should be ahead of time.
Yeah. And I know we touched on this a little bit in the preparing to mix episode, a few episodes back here, but please label things correctly.
That helps the mixing engineers like you would not believe.
Yeah. It's a long-standing joke, right? But you get a bunch
It's not a joke. It's reality.
But it's like everything is called audio 1. It's like,
don't do that.
Yeah. Now if you really, unless you really want to piss off the guy, right? Then knock yourself out, but then don't be mad if you don't get the best out of the mix engineer guy. So placing things. Now you mentioned how things would have been placed from the planning stages.
Yes.
Let's say that it's I mentioned a band like Def Leppard, and especially on the Hysteria record, where there's a lot of this sort of call and response type of thing with certain parts where you might have things going, left speaker, right speaker, that kind of thing. That would be a really effective way, and you want to know that you're placing those correctly, the way they were intended, where they were tracking.
Hence the reason for planning.
Yeah, and also there you mentioned as well, but we should touch on it again, the communication with the artist or the producer.
That's right. You open up the window and you say, "Hey, did you mean to do it like this?"
Yeah, and so unless you're the artist doing it and you're the producer and you're wearing all those hats, then you have that idea. But
which we don't generally recommend. But if you are,
it's again that fresh perspective is really underestimated, I think, sometimes, because it is very, very easy to get tied into parts and just that preconceived notion that we have that this is the way I hear it, but it might not be the best way. So sometimes just having a fresh perspective. Well, hey, why don't you just do this and blah blah blah. It can really help.
Yeah.
So once you've kind of placed things in the mix, in the stereo field where you want them, what's your next go-to thing? Are you starting to now listen for things like EQ or compression or any of that kind of stuff?
I am. I'm kind of weird like that. Although we didn't really touch on it too much in the tracking, I generally tend to set up my guitar sounds using the old Al Schmidt version of doing things, where you try to set up the sound as close to how you want that sound to be in the mix prior to getting to the next stage. And he did it by going into a room and manipulating a microphone until it was in the right spot, and all of a sudden, bingo, you didn't have to EQ, you didn't have to do a whole lot, it was just there. So speaking of how we normally track things, because we did talk about amps in the last episode, what we didn't really mention was the use of software amps which we have mentioned previously in other episodes that we use fairly extensively. And the nice thing about setting up software amplifiers is that you oftentimes, if you have the plethora of everything with the cabinets, that you can do it with the way that we've described it, because I don't think we've actually we should do an episode specifically about setting up software amps. I don't think we've actually done that, but it would be a good episode to do. And so in doing that, it would talk about how you would do it as a hardware amp, or where you actually have the actual amplifier cabinet and mic arrangement that you would be using, or using the software amp doing the exact same thing in the software. And so often I have hundreds, I don't know if they're hundreds, but it's certainly a lot.
More than you'll ever need.
More than I'll ever need. And I keep doing it, and I keep creating more of guitar presets. And
yes, you do. I think you're the reigning world champion in guitar presets at this point.
I want a gold medal for that shit. Damn it. I want the Olympics of software presets. Anyway, I have a ton of presets, and every one of those presets gets me a different sound. And so I have misspent youth of going through a lot of tweaking amps and tweaking software amps, to the point of knowing how to get that EQable like sound from arranging the mic on a cabinet in using an impulse response, most often with a company called Redwires.
Yeah.
So that being said, I'm not often in need of doing a lot of EQing to the guitars that I record as a recording engineer. Right. However, that doesn't mean that I don't, because sometimes in the span of a mix, I still have to do something to carve out a niche for a particular guitar sound. And since we're talking about layering guitars, one of the things that I tend to do is that I will have slightly different tonalities on each side of the spectrum when I'm doing a hard right, hard left pan. In addition to that, if I'm doubling those guitars on each side, or I'm panning them slightly differently, I'm then going to take a little bit of EQ to carve out differentialities between the guitars that are happening on the left and the right.
Right.
And in that, as like a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the theme that I was working on. Yeah. And we had mentioned, oh, hey, what are you doing? You're layering guitars. And you had mentioned something about the guitar sound. And I wrote back, and I think I chuckled about something about it, because they were two very distinctly different,
layering,
very different layers going on to make up the one sound that happened on a side. So, and that also, that included using EQ to kind of carve it a little bit, to have the differentiation between the low end of one guitar layered, doubled and layered with yet another guitar that was taking a little bit more of the high end, and then combining the two together to get one full range sound on one side.
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to reiterate there that you're saying. We, first of all, with the Al Schmidt method there of trying to get it right at the source, obviously that takes a bit of experience from doing that, where that, well, I know this is going to be too much bottom end in the mix. I'm going to have to do this. So you get to that point.
They call that experience.
Yeah. But what you also said there with EQing or just changing the tone slightly to make it a bigger sound, with you doubling, that's what we kind of touched on a little bit last episode as well, where we said that it could be same amp family, but you're EQing it a little bit. So that's the kind of thing that that can just fill it out. And a few episodes ago, we mentioned the band Anthrax, how they had done on one of their late 90s album to get the massive wall of a guitar, where I think they used 3 different guitars and, basically tripled left and triple right, just with slightly different sounds, but it just sounds like one big monster just coming at you. So
monster,
very effectively doing that. So, but if you were to actually, let's step back one more thing, because you brought up software amplification or software emulations.
I did.
If you are getting, let's say that you're not the tracking guy, and somebody is giving you these tracks to do, and they've used emulation, I would very, very much like them to print the amp or the signal just as they would any other guitar signal, right? If they've just done an amp, I want them to print that emulation that they've used, because although I do have a fair amounts, I may not have that plugin that they're using.
Right.
And also it helps me hear what they're going for. Now, in a
Yeah,
perfect world,
we skipped a step there going from the tracking to
Yeah.
the mixing, because in a previous episode where we're talking about mix prep, yes,
Right.
you are bouncing out your sounds to go to
Yeah.
the mix template. So I skipped that over. I glossed it. I didn't say anything
Yeah.
about it, but I was assuming, I was making the
Yes.
assumption, and one should never assume. So it was a bad assumption that,
Right.
yes, I have printed the guitar tones that I tracked with.
Right. Now, at this point as well, if I'm the mix engineer, I would really, really like the DI as well.
Yes.
Because if there are any issues with what's there, I can now, of sorts, reamp.
it.
Even though we're not going to talk about reamping, but there was a project I did recently where I received both of those. It was great. I got the printed track and I had the DI, and there was something that had happened in the conversion there, and it just wasn't going to go away. So I could take the DI, dial up a sound that was very, very close to what was there, and just kind of take care of that on the fly, instead of having to go, hey, you got to go ahead and re-up with this or try to do something. So
you have to re-record that shit.
Yeah. But okay, so we got our tracks, we get them in the stereo field. We're starting to talk about EQ. Now, EQ, there's basically two ways we're doing this. As far as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking of you're either sweetening something that is there, or you're correcting something that might be an issue. And then there's a lot of cross-pollination there. But the first thing I would do is during my initial listen through here, I'm trying to listen for things that might be problem areas. In this case, we're talking about guitar. So in the guitars, is there not enough bottom end? Is there too much bottom end? Is there a harsh frequency something that I might want to notch out or something, or try to tame? So those are EQing issues that I would try to take care of before I even start getting into serious mixing.
Yeah.
You know? So I try to do that. And then once I'm at the, again, air quote, final sort of mixing stage here, then I start thinking about sweetening things where it's, I can make that pop out a little bit more if I add a dB of 2K or something, right? So that's how I tend to deal with EQ when it comes to this type of situation. What about you? If there are issues, if you're not the one to track them and you know that, okay, this is the way I want them to sit.
It's pretty much the same. I'm not going to disagree with anything you said.
Yeah. And generally, the less I have to EQ, the happier I am. Not because I'm working, not because I'm working less, but that means that there are less issues with the audio.
Yep.
And the less issues there are, things just tend to sound more natural. You know, if you have to do something where you have to compensate for a metal guitar player not having any mid-range in their tone, it's just not going to be as good as if if you actually had a little bit of mid-range in your tone when you're tracking. So, yeah. So EQ. Now, what about? Well, actually, maybe we should even talk about if you have any favorite EQs to work with on.
Do you have a favorite guitar EQ?
I do. Well, not
here it comes.
Well, I do and I don't. Let me say style of EQs.
Style. Here we come.
If I'm correcting issues, let's say if I have to notch something out, I like something like an SSL style EQ.
Right.
When I would essentially boost one band and sweep away with
boost and sweep. That sounds like a Karate Kid move.
Yeah, it does, and it's just as effective.
All right.
No, but then sweeping the
sweep the guitar. Do you have a
sweeping
problem with that?
Yeah. Yeah, I would sweep the frequency to find that just where it really pokes out. There's that, and then obviously go back. So that's sort of like having as narrow band as possible that I can get away with, just to kind of get rid of that. So
Yep.
I like something like that for that. I like a little bit more of a softer curve, shall we say, maybe like a Pultec or something, that kind of EQ for sweetening things, where I might bring up a little bit of, high mids perhaps, or possibly rolling off a little bit of the low end. So I tend to do more broader boosts and things like that, unless I'm creating or I'm trying to fix an issue.
Sure.
Track.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I do think we're both Logic users. I do think that the Logic EQ is great. The channel EQ is really, really good. I like that. A lot of people like, although I don't have it, what's the Pro Q? Who is it that makes the
Pro
the
Q? Would that be FabFilter?
That's the one. Yeah. A lot of people really like that one as well. I don't have it, but the idea of being able to sweep and solo certain bands can really help when you kind of dial that kind of stuff in.
Yeah.
So it's not like I have like, oh, I always use a Neve EQ for my guitars or whatever. It's more the style of EQ that I like to work with, what I'm having to do.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. What about you?
Me?
Yeah.
More often than not. My general go-to EQ is the Helios.
Interesting.
Yes, it is an emulation.
Is that just on guitar?
No. Well, no, actually, I find more often than not, the only time I'm using the Helios is on a guitar. And the version that I'm using is an emulation by Universal Audio.
Yeah.
And I just, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's like because maybe Led Zeppelin used it. I have no idea. It has no particular bearing on why I'm using it. I just happen to find that the way the Helios reacts to guitars more often than not is pretty damn nice. Yeah. And it's easy to use, and it's a very broad strokey kind of thing. So it's not meant for like fine tuning, like, oh, there's a real problem in the 1.2K range of this guitar. If there's an issue like that, I then will grab the Logic EQ and notch that shit out. So, but past the Helios, the next favorite plugin that I tend to use or EQ that I tend to use on guitars is the Pultec.
Okay. Yeah.
And again, that's another broad strokey EQ-y thing. Beyond that, if it's not one of those two, it's because there's this particular vibe that I want out of a particular console-y vibe. So if it's a Neve vibe that I'm going for, I'm going to use a Neve EQ. If it's an SSL vibe, I'm going to use an SSL EQ. So it comes down to, and that comes more from wanting the particular vibe than it is that the EQ is better because of whatever. It's because that's the vibe that seems to fit what I'm liking for the song. Does that make sense? Because each EQ does the same sort of thing. It's just whether or not the vibe that it imparts upon how it's doing it is the bigger thing. Yeah. That, I guess, is the better way of saying it. So it comes down more to, am I recording this for a specific reason due to the vibe, or is it because this is the one that I like best? And generally speaking, for guitars, I tend to like the Helios, but then I have Helios, I have Pultec, I have Neve, I have SSL. So I go through all that. Yeah.
But I think it's important to point out, though, I think that a lot of times it's also using the gear that you're really comfortable with. Right. If you know how a certain EQ reacts and how to get the most out of that, where you can get the result just the quickest.
Sure.
I mean, there is I mean, a Neve EQ will sound different than an SSL type of EQ, but it's whatever you're used to working with. I don't think anybody's ever.
Nobody's going to
set
know the difference of whether you're using the Helios or the SSL per se.
Yeah.
And it's
right.
not like they're going to come back to you and go, damn it, you should have used the SSL on this. Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Right. No, I mean, that's true. Cause I don't think anybody's come back to Chris Lordiology and said like, we kind of wish you would have done this on a Neve instead. You know what I mean? It's like, so it's that, first episode we ever did, like know your gear and be comfortable using that.
That's right.
Then before you start thinking about, okay, well, maybe I can get a better result from API or whatever happens to be. But the sort of like the overarching thing there, I guess, is sort of like narrow band type of stuff to fix issues a lot of times, and perhaps a little broader strokes if you're sweetening things.
Yeah.
But that's assuming that we're still in the ballpark of where we want to be at the tracking stage kind of thing.
Right.
Now, what about compression or limiting, anything like that you might do on your parts?
Generally speaking, if it's an electric guitar arrangement and it's got distortion, more often than not, there is no compression, no limiting.
Yeah. There's not a whole lot of dynamics there anyway. Or
no, very often the whole concept of distortion is its own compression in and of itself. So there's really not a massive need for it.
Yeah.
So if you're layering in acoustic guitars and clean guitars, then there's possibly the need for compression. But very often I don't generally compress guitars.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot. Acoustic guitars, yeah, a little bit. Clean guitars, yeah, a little bit. It depends on how much of the body of the instrument needs to come through.
Okay. So you're almost using a compressor in this case for its EQ qualities, almost. I mean, you said you want the body to come through.
Well, meaning that if like on acoustic guitar sounds and a clean electric sounds, a lot of the time, most of what you're getting out of that signal is the attack.
Yeah.
So the body tails off pretty quick, unlike with distortion where the body kind of hangs around for a bit because the whole idea of distortion is it's beefing up the thing. So when I'm going to go use compression or limiting on guitars, it's more often than not, it's going to be on a clean or an acoustic sound to help bring that body back up into the signal, so to speak, and not just be the full on front end attack of the signal if it needs to be there. Now, that being said, that's completely backwards. I would not EQ before I compress unless there's something that I want the compressor to not react to. Then I might EQ that, but that becomes a fixing thing where I'm EQing something out before I'm compressing it. And then I would EQ again on the backside. But more often than not, I don't have those issues with the tracks that I'm working with. So I don't EQ prior to the compression. I would compress first, then EQ if I'm going to compress at all. Right.
Yeah. No, I think, like you said, an acoustic guitar, depending on what it is, or if it's a strumming type of a part, or if it's more of an arpeggiated part or something like that, it can make that sit a little bit better, just kind of even out the levels there a little bit and make it a little bit fuller sounding. So, what kind of, I mean, I know you're a big fan of like the LA2A type of compressor. Is that that would be your go-to on that as well, or
again, vibe of the song is heavily dependent upon the program of what I'm doing.
Let's say if you have a strummy
kind of thing where it isn't like constant needs of attacks, then I'd probably throw an LA2A or a Fairchild.
How much would you take off then?
I know
program dependent,
but more often than not, it's not more than 2-3 dB at max. It's not much.
Yeah, it's not tickling much. That a little bit.
Tickling
it. Yes. Okay, and we could obviously do things where we're compressing to let's say we're dealing with one part where I might compress a little bit more than I normally would be if I have a part where we mentioned in the last episode as well, where we want this sort of delay rhythmic effect happening, like a U2 kind of thing, where I want that to be really nice and level. So I hear that the repeats and the actual notes are going to be sounding like just like one steady stream of notes type of thing, where
program
program dependent. Yep. Cheers. But that would be one where I would definitely work with that to make that sit. And the same thing if I'm using a acoustic guitar where I'm doing that thing we talked about when it's a supporting role for like a driving eighth note type of a thing or whatever happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
I want that just to be like machine gun steady kind of a thing
Gotcha.
where it's not necessarily going to be a super pretty part by itself,
Sure.
but nobody's ever going to hear it in isolation unless we do a demo here, which actually I think it is probably a good idea to bring up. I think for this 2 Minute Tuesday, I think you should show that the theme song
that I created.
that you created to kind of show how you kind of layered that. I think that would be interesting to see.
I could do that. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. So next
Well,
little bit.
So essentially what you're saying is that I'm going to do this 2 Minute Tuesday. I'm going to show how I layered a bunch of guitars for it.
Yes.
And how I used any EQ compression on those guitars. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So rather than feeling compressed all the time like we tend to do when we have to do this, we're going to have a word from our sponsor. So we're going to start talking about bussing those guitars now.
Yes. And the guitar type of thing that I mentioned there, if I have that delay thing going on, that would be one way. I would certainly do a bus thing on that. So I wouldn't necessarily use let's say a compressor on the dry guitar track itself and then on the delay.
Right.
I might actually do a little bit on the guitar, but then I would send both of those to a bus. So I would treat that as sort of like one instrument where I have the dry signal and the delay feeding a bus, and I might add a little bit of compression on that as well. Again, I'm not slamming stuff here, but just to kind of even everything out there.
Right.
That would be one thing. Another thing I might do is bus sort of the main guitars just to a fader, not necessarily for any processing, but just so I have, if I have, let's say that these are multi-track guitars that we're talking about here, layering, instead of having to automate 6 or 8 tracks, I'm just worried about a fader on the aux there to kind of do that. So those be the first two that leap to mind here, why I might use bussing when I get into this kind of stuff as well.
Gotcha.
What about you?
I tend to do a couple of different things. And again, this is program dependent.
Cheers.
Cheers. Exactly. Cheers. Essentially, if it's a whole lot of electric guitars, generally speaking, they're all going to be their individual tracks. They'll have their individual bits of whatever, and then they will be all bussed to a guitar bus, like a guitar stem bus. And on that bus, I might do a final bit of EQ. I might do a little bit of compression or limiting on that bus in and of itself to kind of glue all those instruments to one kind of grouping. And if I do that, it's the compression or limiting first and then the EQ second on that bus. That being said, sometimes when I'm layering acoustic guitars with electric guitars, and I have recorded that acoustic guitar with more than one channel, meaning that it might be a mic and a direct or 2 mics or 2 mics and a direct, which would be kind of crazy, but I've done it. I will bus those 3 together, those 2 or 3 tracks of acoustic guitar of the same guitar using multiple inputs to one bus inside that then goes bust to the main guitar bus as well. So it'd be double bust, so to speak.
Right.
Almost like a UK double decker.
Yes.
And I will treat the acoustic guitar bus with whatever it needs, and then it will get the overall treatment from the entire bus arrangement of all the guitars, which generally, again, I don't do a whole lot of compression in that regard, just because most often with the electric guitars, you don't need it unless something, as you're saying, needs to be machine gun perfect or accurate or whatever, and then you might clamp on something, but it becomes a choice of program dependent.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And it's just an easier, manageable mix.
Yes.
When you're sitting with that. And
easier manageable.
Yeah. So now Yeah, go ahead.
Well, when we get into this point where you're starting to hear everything kind of working together and you're getting into the song at this point, you might find that certain parts that you actually recorded no longer fit what's going on because you've got all these different elements playing against each other at this point, and you didn't plan perfectly, because whoever does, you're going to come across parts that may no longer work. And at this point, you have to make that producer hat decision to say, sayonara, you're a beautiful part, but you're not needed now.
Got to give it the Spanish Archer. Got it. the elbow. Archer. Yeah. Okay. Got to get rid of it.
Yeah. So it might come down to the fact that you've now EQ'd it, you've compressed it, you've got it going in, doing whatever it is that you're doing within your mix. And you find that the rhythm of it might be clashing with something else in the song, and yanky wanky, it comes out. Or maybe it's just not having the Thor's hammer impact that you wanted.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, no,
you lose it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, those can be rough decisions, like we said before, but they are important ones. So
they are.
Just because you recorded it doesn't mean that it has to stay in the final mix.
Yeah.
If it's not.
Was there a story like in one of the earlier episodes about Evan and Jaron?
Yeah, you told that story.
Did I?
So
are you sure?
Yes.
Okay. Then yes. I'm not going to repeat it now.
No, got to go back and listen to it.
Got to go back and listen to that episode and watch that. That might be an episode of like, oh, it didn't actually happen. We talked about it outside of recording.
I'm pretty sure you mentioned it. Yeah. But we talked about that, but don't get married to parts, right?
Exactly.
Even if that's your only creative contribution to the track, it doesn't mean that it's always a good one. So
it's nothing personal. It's all about
and
the song.
And it could be, oh, it's a great idea, but it just doesn't work in this case.
That's right. You hide it away and you put it somewhere else.
Right. And you have to consider, or what I would consider anyway, is like the hierarchy of importance in the song. Let's say, for example, like, the guitar part sounds really, really cool, but now it's having an issue with the vocal. Well, the vocal is going to win, so, you got to get rid of the guitar part, unless you're certain guitar players that we won't name, but
wouldn't be a Swede, would it? No,
it might be.
So yes, however, I have had an issue in one particular mix that drove me absolutely batty, and it had everything to do with how a guitar sound was reacting to one particular cymbal hit.
Wow.
It was crazy. It was creating this bizarre dissonance in the song where the chord just sounded wrong, but it was the right chord. The guitar was playing it correctly, and the guitar was imperative that it needed to be there, and it was the cymbal hit. So I ended up having to do a very, very minute, quick EQ cut of a cymbal.
Wow.
To avoid the dissonance that it was creating on one particular chord hit on a guitar.
That's crazy.
Yes.
That's
crazy.
So
sometimes it's not the guitar, but when it is the guitar, you lose it. You lose it. It doesn't need to be.
Yeah. Right. And so all these concepts that we've talked about here, again, I just want to reiterate that at least out of my mouth, I end up talking about rock and things a lot, but these are not just concepts that are just for rock stuff, right? Rock right. Or metal. The same concepts apply to whatever
guitar oriented track you're doing. It could be Americana, it could be country, it could be bluegrass. It don't matter.
Yeah, same thing. So let the style of music that you're doing determine what should stay and what should go. What should go, and also how you kind of place things. And of course, you can push things a little bit here and there, but like I think we mentioned in a prior episode here, it's okay to push boundaries, but if you're pushing too far, you might get some pushback from your audience, So, stay in what's going to sound cool for what you're doing there, and all of these tips and tricks will work.
Yeah. And with that, I think we're going to wrap a little bow on this, and we're going to say, tune in next week for part number 4.
Yay! Thanks, Jody.
Thank you, Chris. And all of you out there and inside the recording studio land, we'll see you